This is Nightmare in Wisconsin. The trial of Taylor Schabusiness. Accusations of first-degree intentional homicide, strangulation, mutilation, dismemberment, and necrophilia. We bring you raw, unfiltered courtroom audio from the trial of Taylor Schabusiness. Nightmare in Wisconsin.
This is one of the photographs that was previously disclosed to the defense to raise objections prior to the motion hearing. Defense did not object to the photograph at that particular time.
Motion hearing on June 13 last month.
Correct. So obviously with the purpose of addressing these issues to try to head these off, this photograph was not objected to. However, this morning we're objecting to relatively benign photos of closed body bags. So I anticipate the defense would object to this photograph. It does depict the crime victim's face, at autopsy. And the state believes the photograph, while it does depict his face, and I understand it is arguably prejudicial, it is highly relevant because it demonstrates the indicia of strangulation, which is ultimately the doctor's determination as to the cause of his death, and can describe why he believes that the strangulation occurred prior to his death. And it actually shows a small portion of the remainder of his body, which demonstrates different coloration. So it's a highly relevant photograph that the doctor is capable of describing. And I wanted to head this off and have the court address that issue outside the presence of the jury. I can mark the photo and provide a copy to the court so that you have an opportunity to view it.
Okay, why don't we do that? Let's get it marked, and then I'll take a look at it. Mr. Fraley, presumably you've seen it.
I've seen a lot of pictures. I haven't seen this one right now. Now I've seen it.
And I would note for the record, this is the only photograph that I intend to show of the crime victim. The remainder of the injuries that we'll discuss with the doctor intend to do using diagrams.
Mr. Fraley, do you have an objection? We went through this, as I said, on the 13th of June, but is there an objection?
Your Honor, I put a lot of time into, reviewing all the pictures and did file a motion making objections to photographs that I thought were, that should not come into evidence. But we're in a trial now, and as a defense attorney, you don't know what the state's going to present as evidence. This picture I would object to on behalf of my client. We already have a picture of what the victim looked like when he was alive. That was already presented by the state. Now they're presenting a second picture. I would argue that this picture, if it has any relevancy to the case, it's highly prejudicial. It's an autopsy picture. I don't believe a lot of people on the jury have ever seen something like this before, and it could shock their conscience and create horror in their minds. So I would object to it, Your Honor, on all of those grounds. Thank you.
Okay. And Dr. Exhibit 77 was a photo that was taken at your office during the course of the autopsy. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, well, the issues that the court has to address in these kinds of objections relating to prejudice versus the probative value is really a balancing kind of a test. And the issue that's being addressed with the court, what this is being offered for, is to demonstrate the means of death and which is an important part of the case, of course. And I ruled earlier at the hearing in June that I was not going to permit the exhibit of the crime victim's head in the bucket. This is a different really set of circumstances. This is a photograph taken in the process of an autopsy. We have the coroner here, who's really a witness that's an important piece of this case, frankly for both sides of the case to hear from. And this is a photograph taken in the process of him doing his job, and one that I think, given what I've heard by way of an offer of proof, is going to be useful in him describing the means or the method of death of the victim. I'm satisfied for those reasons that although there's certainly prejudice to the photo, many things that come into a trial are prejudicial to one side or another. I'm satisfied the probative value in this case outweighs the prejudicial effect. I'm going to allow the photo to be to come into evidence, and then the doctor can explain what's shown on it and why it's relevant to the case. So that's going to be the order of the court.
Your Honor?
Yes.
So with respect to the court, just as further additional argument,
Want to further argue my decision?
no,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Your Honor, though, it's just kind of, in my opinion, sort of highly unusual that this picture, of the deceased would be presented to the jury when the doctor can easily testify about, the cause and manner of death. The picture isn't going to really add too much, in my opinion, but I totally respect the court's ruling. I just want to make sure I made all my arguments to the court.
Sure. And I understand that. Photographs can be helpful to juries in understanding what witnesses are testifying to. For example, I think that argument could be made probably regarding every single photograph that's been entered into evidence, and that is, well, we can tell you what it looked like, and so you don't need to see a picture of it. Photos can be helpful. They can. And so I understand that argument. The doctor could just simply describe everything, but the question is this going to be helpful to the jury? And will the prejudicial effect outweigh the probative value? I don't think so. I do think it'll be helpful to the jury, and so for those reasons, I'm going to allow it to be admitted. So that's the order of the court. Anything before council takes a brief recess, Mr. Lezay?
Just briefly, so on the issue of the photograph, while we are showing it to the jury, I would ask that the media not show a copy of that photograph on the live stream.
I will enter an order that the media is not permitted to show that photograph on the live stream or take a picture of it in any other fashion. Anything else?
No.
Mr. Fralick, anything else before break?
No.
Okay. Very good. Then you can step down. Doctor, we'll take a break. I think we've taken up about half of the break already, but try to be back in 5 or 10 minutes. More recess. Anything to take up before we go back on the record with the jury? Mr. Lezay?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Fralick?
No, thank you.
Very good. Then we'll bring in the jury. Doctor, if you want to come on back up and take the witness stand. Okay, be seated. Okay, we're back on the record, and with that, Mr. Lezay, the witness is yours.
I think we were about to publish the 3 photographs that the doctor had previously described. Is that 74, 75, and 76?
Yes.
Dr. Tranquita, Exhibit 74 that you previously described, is that now visible on the screen?
That is correct.
And Exhibit 75 that you previously described, is that now visible on the screen?
That is correct.
And Exhibit 76 that you previously described, is that now visible on the screen?
That is correct.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, Doctor, if you could confirm the human remains from Shad Thyrion, you received them in the form that was just demonstrated in those photos, is that correct?
That is correct.
From a chain of custody and evidence standpoint, did everything appear to be in order when you received it at the Dane County Medical Examiner's office prior to autopsy?
Yes, they did.
Can you give a general description of the process that was utilized to conduct the autopsy in this case?
Of course. At the scene, we performed the examination as I previously described. In addition, because this occurred during the time of the pandemic, we also did a nasopharyngeal swab to determine if the decedent was COVID positive, and he was. Upon beginning the examination, our first step is usually to take x-rays of the body. And this is a very helpful tool that we use to try to determine if there's any fractures, foreign objects, or what the general condition is of the skeletal system of the decedent. For this, the bag can be intact, which is a helpful way of doing it. Once the bag is opened, the next step is to begin to take as-is photographs. In other words, photographs of the body exactly as it's received, before it's cleaned, before it's washed, before anything is removed. The next step after that is to collect trace evidence, if any can be found. This can involve a sexual assault kit, swabs, fingernail clippings, everything in an effort to try to find any DNA evidence that might be useful. Once that is done, the body can then be washed and cleaned, and then we begin our external examination. The external examination is an examination of the outside of the body, not only for any identifying marks, tattoos, scars, but also to get a sense of what injuries are present, what trauma is present on the body, and if we have the entire body present as we suspected at the scene. So typically at that point, we begin to take our inventory of what is present, and then we also begin to examine each fragment to see what is present, what is trauma, what is artifact, and what is real injury.
And the process that you described as the general process, is that what you utilized here?
That's correct. And by the documentation of the external, we take photographs, we take measurements, and I take diagrams as well to try to recreate for the reader what I see at the table.
And to reiterate, ultimately, what is the goal of conducting the autopsy?
The ultimate goal is to determine the cause and manner of death. But a secondary goal is to try to document the findings that are present so that if somebody challenges or disagrees with these findings, that the evidence is there, that I can provide my explanation for my reasoning and a historical record of what goes on within the autopsy room.
And before we get into the specifics, ultimately, were you able to determine what you believe to be a cause and manner of death for Shad Thyrion?
Yes, I was.
Doctor, is it typical that not only the cause and manner of death, but the findings or the bases to support those findings are generally outlined in a report?
Yes, they are.
And did you prepare such a report in this case?
Yes, I did.
Dr. Tranquil, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 78. Can you review that and identify that document for the jury?
Exhibit number 78 is a copy of the autopsy report that was generated on our case number 223433 for Shad Thyrion.
Doctor, is that a 14-page report?
That is correct.
And you believe that report accurately outlines your findings following the autopsy and investigation into the death of Shad Thyrion?
Yes, I do.
And are the opinions that are outlined in this report and the final diagnoses, are those opinions that are consistent with your medical training and experience?
Yes, they are.
Judge, I would move for the admission of Exhibit 78.
Any objection, Mr. Freilich?
No.
That'll be received.
And Doctor, again, before we get into the bases or the specifics, what was your opinion as it relates to the cause and manner of death of Shad Thyrion?
It is my medical opinion that the cause of death of Shad Thyrion is strangulation, and that the manner of death is homicide.
Can you explain for the jury the difference between cause and manner?
Of course. Cause of death is the mechanism by which somebody dies. If one wants to think of it as an example, a gunshot wound of the head is a cause of death. That is a mechanism by which somebody dies. The manner of death is the category or classification of that mechanism. So in other words, a gunshot wound of the head can be a suicide, it can be an accidental death, or it can be a homicidal death. The cause of death you want to think about as the mechanical process which results in someone's death. And the manner of death is the circumstances or the totality of the story, including the investigation and the scene findings, and the history, which helps you categorize that mechanism in terms of the class of death that this occurs.
And Doctor, I'll first address the issue of cause of death. Can you outline for the jury the findings or the circumstances that support your opinion that the cause of death in this case was strangulation?
Of course. On examination of the body, I am looking for any findings that might indicate what the potential cause of death might be. In this case, on my examination of the decedent, I had a number of findings that were consistent with a strangulation death. To begin with, I had plethory or cyanosis of the head and upper neck. And by plethory or cyanosis, I mean a deep purplish discoloration or congestion of the head and neck, such that I know that return of blood flow back to the body from the head is interrupted or blocked. Along those lines, I had numerous petechial hemorrhages or burst blood vessels of the skin of the face, of the conjunctivae around the eyes or the pink around the eyes. I had hemorrhages as well of the whites of the eyes or the sclera, and I also had hemorrhages of the mucosa of the inside of the mouth. These are all consistent with sharp pressure being applied to the neck and the blood vessels of the neck, causing bursting of these blood vessels. In addition, the tongue was protuberant outside of the mouth, consistent with the tongue being driven up and outwards during the process of strangulation. When I examined the tongue itself, there was a patterned indentation on the surface of the tongue, consistent with an object being pressed hard across the tongue such that it left an indentation within the tongue. There were also abrasions or scrapes on the surface of the tongue, and there was an intramuscular hemorrhage or bleeding within the tongue. This is often seen in cases of strangulation, where the tongue can be trapped between the teeth and the jaw is driven upwards and trapping the tongue between the teeth. Once I dissected down the neck, I had hemorrhages of the muscles of the neck as well. And this is also classically seen often in cases of strangulation, where blunt force trauma is applied to the neck during the process of compression, and you have injury and bleeding within the neck muscles. These hemorrhages were not only in the neck muscles, but they were also in the soft tissues surrounding the trachea, or airway, or windpipe, surrounding the larynx, or upper airway, all the way down to the cervical spine or the spinal column as it goes all the way down to the vertebra. So in other words, I had hemorrhages going from the surface all the way down deep into the neck muscle structures, indicative of significant force being applied to the neck.
Just wanted to follow up on that particular last point. Doctor, you indicated in multiple areas where you saw evidence of strangulation. Did those same areas allow you to make some sort of determination or form an opinion as to the amount of force or the amount of time that force would have been applied to the neck?
Objection, speculation.
I think that's exactly what his professional role is.
Overruled.
This is a great deal of force. We're not talking about simply injuries to the superficial structures, for example, the skin. I have injuries to the very thick muscles on the sides of the neck. I have injuries to the soft tissues beneath this. I have injuries to all the soft tissues surrounding the neck. And I also have hemorrhage on the soft tissue on the anterior aspect of the cervical spine. This is hemorrhage deep through multiple layers of the neck, consistent with a great deal of force being applied and a great deal of injury.
Doctor, as we've heard, obviously there is a significant amount of mutilation to the body or disruption of the body in multiple different places. Can you describe how you are able to determine that those other cutting injuries to the portions of the body are post-mortem as opposed to causing the death of Shad?
In my examination, there was extensive post-mortem mutilation of the body. And I believe that this is post-mortem mutilation because there is no hemorrhage associated with these injuries. In other words, I have multiple sharp force trauma with multiple stab wounds, multiple punctures, multiple incised wounds of the skin, deep cuts within the muscles and tendons and soft tissue, deep cuts within the bone. But all of these cuts are non-hemorrhagic. In other words, there's no blood or bleeding associated with it. These are consistent with post-mortem mutilation. In other words, there's no circulation going on. There's very little blood actually still left within the vascular system. This is all consistent with the body being dismembered after death.
And, Doctor, at this point, I intend to show you a photograph which is sensitive in nature. I intend to publish that photograph for the jury. So I'm putting the jury and also the media on notice that I intend to use the photograph at this point and then have the judge describe it. Is it 77? Yes. Doctor, clerk is showing you what's been marked previously as Exhibit 77. Can you identify what that photograph is?
Yes, I can.
What is it?
This is a depiction of the right side of Shad Thyrion's face at the autopsy examination. In the photograph is the right side of his face along with the grayscale ruler with the case number and also a L-shaped ABFO ruler, which is an American Board of Forensic Odontology ruler. It shows dimensions in 2 scales. The right side of his face shows his eyes closed and his tongue protuberant, pledged between the right side of his mouth. He has abrasions or scrapes that are visible on the right side of his face and nose and cheek. At the lower aspect of the photograph are numerous sharp force injuries depicted on the upper chest.
Your Honor, I would ask for the admission of that photograph or move for admission of the photograph and ask for permission to publish at this time.
Okay, objection has already been made.
Same objection as before.
I'm going to overrule the objection and the picture can be published. Yeah, and I'll note that the media is not allowed to publish this photo. They're indicating affirmative.
Doctor, the photograph depicted in Exhibit 77, is that now visible on the screen?
Yes, it is.
Can you utilize that photograph to describe some of the indicia of strangulation that you had previously outlined for the jury?
Yes, I can. As you look at his face compared to the lower aspect of his body, which is visible in the upper right corner, you can see how much more purple and how much more congested it is compared to the rest of his body. Similarly, on the particularly you can see around the cheek, there are small pinpoint hemorrhages or circular petechial hemorrhages also on the right temple, which are burst hemorrhages present on the skin. And these are referred to as petechial hemorrhages, caused from ruptured capillaries on the skin surface. His tongue is protuberant and visible in this photograph coming out the right side of his mouth. Subsequently, as we examine the tongue further, we can see that there are abrasions and contusions of the tongue from impacts between the teeth. There is also a ligature oppression, as we previously described, on the surface of the tongue, which is not visible here. It's hidden by his mouth.
And Doctor, you talked about the coloration and how that's relevant to the strangulation as the cause of death. Is the coloration from the body, is that also relevant to your determination that injuries to the body were postmortem?
It does, yes.
Doctor, in addition to preparing a report and taking photographs of the injuries, do you also utilize diagrams?
Yes, I do.
And what is the purpose of those diagrams?
My primary purpose is to document the findings in as many different ways as I can. I take photographs. I take diagrams. I take measurements. I want to recreate the findings for the viewer, for the reader, so that they can go back to them and see what I saw at the autopsy table. I also find that diagrams are easier for people to review and people to look at who do not look at bodies on a regular basis. They're less traumatic. They protect the privacy of the decedent a little more. And I think that they are a document which I've found to be very valuable for conveying what I found in a very easy to understand and not disturbing way.
Doctor, I've provided Exhibit 79. Can you take a look at that and describe what that is for the jury?
Exhibit 79 is a copy of my autopsy notes and diagrams that I generated on this case. It includes head and neck diagrams. It includes diagrams of the entire body and diagrams of the skeletal system as well.
Your Honor, I would move for admission of Exhibit 79 and ask for permission to publish the diagrams.
Any objection?
No.
All right, that can be published to the jury. I'll receive it, and it can be published to the jury.
And Judge, for the diagrams and the subsequent discussion, could the lights be dimmed as well?
Sure.
Dr. Tranquita, is the screen now displaying what would be the first page of Exhibit 79?
Yes, it does.
And can you note what's of importance from your medical perspective as to these diagrams?
Of course. This is the front page of what's referred to as my autopsy notes. And this allows me a front and back view of the body to depict findings. Also, a spot at the top where I can enter the general demographic features. In other words, weight of the body as it's recovered, approximated age, frame, hair color, eye color, what's the state of the postmortem changes, such as rigor mortis or livor mortis. And then with the front and back diagrams, I'm able to show sort of general findings. In this case, because there were so many sharp force injuries and injuries of the head and neck, I saved them for separate diagrams. And this is more for general findings. The most relevant ones that I want to kind of emphasize on is there is marked congestion of the head and neck, but the rest of the body is relatively pale. There were some contusions or blunt force trauma injuries of the remainder of the body. There was a contusion on the upper aspect of the left side of the chest, a contusion on the upper aspect of the right side of the chest. There were abrasions of the right upper extremity. There was a contusion or bruise of the anterior aspect of the right knee, and there was a collapsed blister on the left heel. He also had a gray metal ring that was present on the little finger of the left hand.
Doctor, on the screen, are we now showing page 2 of Exhibit 79?
Yes, we are.
And specifically, I draw your attention to the top right-hand corner of that. There's a depiction or a drawing. What is that?
In the top right-hand drawing is a depiction of the surface of the decedent's tongue. With my crude art skills, I apologize. But I'm depicting where the arc-like abrasions are present on the tongue, and that's at the tip, those curvilinear interrupted abrasions. There was a contusion of the right side of the tip of the tongue, or bruise. And then on the back and middle aspect of the right side of the tongue, there were two parallel, very patterned, very regular indentation rows consistent with a potential ligature being pressed against the neck. Being pressed against the tongue.
Doctor, based on your prior experience with strangulation cases, is that something that is typically seen or ordinarily seen where there's a potential ligature strangulation, that you may see ligature marks not only on the neck but also on other parts of the body?
Yes, it occurs when the ligature shifts during the assault. If the ligature shifts, often the victim or the decedent will try to get their chin underneath the ligature. I can sometimes see injuries across the chin, across the lower lip, or inside the mouth as the ligature is shifting in position before it's placed again on the neck.
Doctor, you mentioned that you were present on scene and had the opportunity to observe two metal dog chains that were collected by law enforcement. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And did you note any consistency between those chains that were collected and the marks that you observed on Shad Thyrion's body?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
When I'm observing injuries or trying to interpret injuries, I am looking for patterns. Anything that I can use to convey to an investigator, hey, you may want to look for this at the scene. In this case, we had very organized, repeating, interrupted indentations on the surface of the tongue, very evenly spaced apart. This would not be inconsistent with the pattern of a chain and the chain links as they twist, leaving separate corner impressions on the surface of the tongue.
Doctor, does the screen now depict the third page of Exhibit 79?
Yes, it does.
And could you describe for the jury the significance of these particular diagrams?
Because there were so many findings, I separated out the head and neck diagrams to a separate diagram. This diagram depicts multiple different views of the decedent's head and neck. Similar to the photograph, we can see that there is congestion of the head above the level of decapitation. In other words, there's purplish discoloration or cyanosis or plethory of the upper aspect of the neck and head, consistent with congestion. On the right side of the decedent's face and nose is an abrasion. There are contusions at the left temple, just above the ear, and at the right temple, just above the ear as well, or bruises. Once I dissected down the neck, I found hemorrhages of the muscles of the neck on the left side and right side of the neck. I also found sharp force injuries of the outer aspect of the left eyebrow and outer aspect of the left upper eyelid, and then also on the left side of the tip of the nose. I believe that these are also post-mortem artifact because they're non-hemorrhagic, there's no redness, there's no swelling. This is consistent with cutting a body that's already been dead. Across the neck, I am depicting the point of decapitation of the decedent. This was roughly at the level of cervical vertebra C5, C6. We have about 7 cervical vertebrae. So it's just above the base of the neck. Where we have complete decapitation. In other words, it's going completely through the neck and the head is separate from the remainder of the body. There are also a number of sharp force injuries above and below the level of decapitation, consistent with multiple cuts attempted as the person is trying to get through the neck.
Now, Doctor, does the screen show what is page 4 of Exhibit 79?
Yes, it does.
I don't think I will ask you to describe every injury that's denoted on this particular diagram, as we would be here a while, but could you describe generally what is depicted in this diagram?
Of course. This is a front and back view of the decedent's body, where I'm attempting to show the points of dismemberment, as well as points of sharp force injury that are present. The contusions I've also included here to try to show where they are, or bruises and abrasions. But for the most part, I want to focus on the sharp force trauma. In particular, in this case, we have the head has been decapitated at the level of the lower neck. The back has been largely flayed and defleshed. In other words, the skin of the back has been removed. Also, the muscles of the back have been removed so that we have exposed rib cage and spine. The torso, so extending from about the neck to the groin, has been bisected or cut in half at the level of the lumbar vertebra or the vertebra of the lower spine, so that we have access to the inside of the torso, both the pelvis and the upper aspect of the chest and abdomen. We have attempted amputations at the level of the right shoulder and right elbow. We have numerous cuts and stab wounds of the extremities. When we get to the abdomen and thighs, we have areas of skin removal where flaps of skin have been removed. Where we get to the right thigh, all of the soft tissue has been removed, so we're down to the bone. In other words, all we have is exposed femur for the length of the femur. When we get to the lower extremities, the left lower extremity has been amputated to the level of the knee. The kneecap or patella was recovered separately. We have another amputation from the knee to the level of the ankle, and the left foot was recovered from within the left chest cavity, placed within there. At the right lower extremity, we have, again, the femur, which has been largely defleshed, but I was able to reapproximate the pieces of muscle and pieces of skin to recreate what was there. And then we had the right knee to the right foot still intact.
Doctor, based on your training and experience, what kind of amount of time would be necessary in order to create this sort of disruption to a body?
Objection, speculation,
Overruled.
foundation.
Overruled.
It is my medical opinion that this would be quite a few hours. We have decapitation, we have dismemberment, we have transection of the torso. Subsequently, internally, the body has been eviscerated. In other words, we have entered inside the body through various cuts, both at the abdomen and between the ribs, where the victim's organs have been removed, largely one by one. We have castration of the decedent. The decedent has been castrated as well. We have cutting or sawing through chop mark injuries of the bones. It is my medical opinion that this would have taken quite a great deal of time.
And Doctor, is the screen now depicting page 5 of Exhibit 79?
Yes, it is.
And what are you attempting to denote here as opposed to on the previous exhibit?
Again, I don't want to overload one particular set of diagrams. So in this set of diagrams, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show the points of skeletal dismemberment. In other words, where in the skeletal system the body has been taken apart. So here I'm illustrating that the head and neck have been severed at the level of C5, C6. I have that the torso has been severed at the level of about L3, L4 of the lumbar spine. I have shown that the pelvis has been cut right at the pubic bone and separated open. I've shown that there is attempt to sharp force trauma at the distal right arm or right humerus, and also at the proximal right forearm or right radius and ulna. I'm showing that we have amputations or severing of the left femur, both just proximal to the hip and at the distal left femur. I have shown that the left kneecap has been separated, and I've also shown that the left lower leg has also been separated at the distal tibia and fibula. At the right lower extremity, the right hip socket has been opened and separated. I have severing of the right lower extremity at the level of the knee, and the kneecap on the right side is received with the lower leg.
Doctor, you had mentioned attempted dismemberment or attempted amputation. Can you describe what you mean by that?
Of course. There are some areas where there are cuts through the muscle and cuts through the skin, but they do not completely transect the limb or extremity. So there's evidence of cutting deeply into these tissues in the postmortem state, but not complete transection, so they are still attached. On the bones, there's multiple evidence of sharp force trauma to the bones, even in areas where the bone is still in one piece. Evidence of previous attempt to cut or saw through or transect the bone. These pieces of bone were
I'm
collected.
object, non-responsive.
Just wait for another question, Doctor. Go ahead.
Doctor, is it typical that in the course of your investigation into a death that you would ask for toxicology to be performed on the decedent?
Yes, I would.
And was that done in this particular case?
Yes, it was.
What were some of the challenges that you faced with respect to toxicology?
The largest challenge was the amount of disruption of the vascular system. This body was essentially bloodless. So what I did is at the scene, I collected a hemorrhagic fluid that was present in one of the containers where the body was kept, with the hope that some of this was blood that was drained from the decedent's remains as they sat within the container. And these were submitted for toxicology. In addition, I saved tissues as well, should there have been a need for that.
Based on your training and experience, are there concerns about the accuracy of the toxicology based on how you had to obtain the fluid for toxicology?
Yes, there are.
And what are those concerns?
This was hemorrhagic fluid that was collected from in this case, the bucket where a portion of the decedent's remains were recovered. Whether this all represents the decedent's blood, somebody else's blood, substances that may have been present in the bucket before the decedent was placed in there, whether the blood is entirely blood or a combination of blood and cerebrospinal fluid and vomit and other fluids, whether there is water present in the bucket as well. So as a result, these findings are noted, but they should be taken in that context and with those caveats.
And in terms of the toxicology report, what substances did you note from the fluid that was submitted for toxicological testing?
From the fluid that was submitted, we found cocaine. We found cocaine metabolite benzoyl ecgonine. We found methamphetamine. We found amphetamine. We found delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or the active component of marijuana. And I believe we also found nicotine, which is present in most tobacco products.
Now, doctor, you found a number of those substances in the fluid. Are those substances, in your opinion, contributory to Shad Thyrion's death in any way?
I do not believe so, no.
I think you mentioned this earlier, Doctor, when you were describing the general process of the autopsy, but is swabbing of the body something that you typically do?
When I suspect that there may be the involvement of another individual within a death, yes, swabbing is something that I typically do.
And is that something that was done in this particular case?
Yes, I did.
Can you describe the process for swabbing and then the process for maintaining the integrity of the evidence that's collected in those swabs?
Of course. Before the body is cleaned or altered in any way, while it is still resting on an evidence sheet, what I do is I collect DNA swabs of the external surfaces of the body. Typically, I'll go for areas where I suspect the greatest possibility of contact. In this case, I believe they are all listed on pages 14 of the autopsy report. So it included the left and right sides of the forehead, the left and right cheeks, the left and right sides of the chin, the left and right sides of the neck, both sides of the chest, what was left of the skin surface of the abdomen, what was left of the skin surface of the back, the left and right arms, the left and right forearms, the left and right wrists, the palmar aspects of the left and right hands, the dorsal aspects of the left and right hands, the skin of the left thigh, the skin of both legs, the skin of both feet, and then I took oral, penile, scrotal, and rectal swabs. And then of all the fragments of skin that were recovered separate from the decedent, I swabbed the skin surfaces of those as well. So those were 12 separate fragments of skin were each swabbed. After that, they're air dried, packaged, and given to law enforcement.
And that process was followed in this case with respect to the integrity of the evidence?
That is correct.
Is it typical that you obtain a swab that's intended to be either a swab or some sort of evidence that is intended to be a known sample for the deceased?
That is correct.
What is the typical process for that?
Typically, we collect what's referred to as a DNA card, which is a blood spot card that is air dried and then subsequently can be used for DNA testing.
Do you know if that was used in this case?
Yes, it was.
Do you know if you also did a buccal swab in this case, or a swab from the inside of the mouth of the decedent?
That's correct. That was with my oral swab that I took earlier.
Nothing further at this time.
Cross-examination, Mr. Freilich.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Tranquita, good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Did you determine the time of death and the date of death for the deceased?
At best, I can determine approximately how long a person has been dead. But in terms of determining the time of death and the date of death, we list the time where they're examined by a medical professional.
This particular case, you were contacted by the Brown County Medical Examiner, or Petra Schwab, correct?
She was Petra Schwab was our lead investigator at the time. That's correct.
Okay. She's not a medical examiner, but she's a director, correct?
I believe now her title is Director of Operations, correct?
And she contacted you to secure your assistance with the investigation in this particular case?
That is correct.
Were you contacted on February 23rd of 2022?
I believe that is correct.
Okay. And you were briefed on some of the issues or what may or may not have happened, correct?
That is correct.
And then you traveled from Madison to where the location on Stony Brook Lane, or where did you go?
That is correct. I traveled to the home on Stony Brook Lane
Okay.
in Green Bay.
And do you recall the time that you got there, roughly? Was it in the morning?
Unfortunately, not offhand. I believe it was in the morning, but it's difficult to say. Yeah.
Okay.
It's been a while.
All right. Fair to say that the facts with regards to this case or the circumstances were quite unusual based on your training and experience. Is that fair?
Could you describe what you mean by unusual?
You're listening to True Crime Today in the Hidden Killers podcast continuous coverage of the trial of Taylor Shabusiness, Nightmare in Wisconsin. Press subscribe so you don't miss any of our continuing coverage. More raw trial audio next.